Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. I'm really excited for this one. We're going deep, really deep into the foundations of design. We're talking the core principles, the building blocks, the stuff that makes design tick.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got a fantastic source to guide us. It's called Estudio de Diseño. That's Study of Design in English by Guillermo Gonzalez Ruiz. Now, don't worry, we're not going to turn you into expert designers overnight.
Yeah, this isn't a crash course or anything.
Yeah.
It's more like a journey of discovery. We're going to uncover these essential ideas that really shape how we see and understand the world around us, how we interact with objects, spaces, you name it. It's for anyone who's ever been curious about design, whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who appreciates the power of visuals.
Absolutely. Our mission here, you could say, is to distill those core insights.
Yeah, we want to give you that aha moment, help you understand the structure and the thought processes behind effective design without getting bogged down in all the technical jargon.
Totally. It's about those fundamental building blocks, the underlying psychology, the stuff that makes things click.
And speaking of things clicking, Gonzalez Ruiz throws out a really fascinating idea right from the start. He argues that Gestalt theory, which we'll dig into more later on, is one of the most scientifically sound frameworks we have for understanding how we, as humans, relate to form, space, time, even movement,
It's interesting, isn't it? It makes you realize that visual perception, something we often take for granted, actually has these really profound implications for how we experience the world.
So before we get too far, let's set the stage here. One of the things that struck me right away is how the author views design itself.
Yeah, he doesn't see it as just this artistic thing.
Yeah.
He actually positions design as both a science and a technology. He emphasizes its roots in empirical observation, theoretical frameworks, philosophical inquiry. He even brings in epistemology, which is the study of knowledge itself.
So it's not just about making things look pretty then.
Not at all. Design, as the book lays out, is this carefully planned process of creation. The word design itself, he points out, comes from the Spanish proyector, which means to imagine plans, to project forward.
To plan.
And while it's connected to the idea of a project, design really zeroes in on the formal configuration of a work. It's about giving shape and structure deliberately with intention.
And it's not done in isolation either, right? He talks about how design draws on all these other fields.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes that design is interwoven with a whole bunch of other disciplines. I mean, think about it. We've got social psychology, exploring how people behave in groups, psychoanalysis, delving into the inner workings of the mind, linguistics, breaking down language and its structures. Then there's semiology and semiotics, which are all about signs and symbols and how we make sense of them. And there's more. So many more.
It's a pretty long list. Sounds like you need to be a bit of a Renaissance person to be a good designer, huh?
Kind of, yeah. He mentions morphology, heuristics, topology, ergonomics, cybernetics. We're even talking robotics and telematics.
Wow. So design really pulls from everywhere, it seems.
Right. And the key takeaway here is that design isn't just the sum of all these parts. It's not like you just take a little bit of psychology, a dash of linguistics, and bam, you've got design. It's what he calls a mestizaje with pureness. It's this subtle blend, a fusion,
A unique combination.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. He stresses that interdisciplinary knowledge is absolutely key for designers.
So you need to wear a lot of different hats.
Definitely. You have to understand not just aesthetics, but also psychology, how things function practically, the principles of communication, and so much more.
All right, so we've talked about what design is and all the different fields it draws from. But what's the ultimate aim? Why go through all this, scientific rigor and interdisciplinary thinking?
The source is really clear about this. Designing is all about directing the creation of forms towards a purpose. It's about planning, conceiving, and then actually bringing a work into being.
Materializing it.
Exactly. And that work could be a physical space, an object, or even a piece of communication. And the goal is usually to bring that work into the world, either through industrial production or some form of widespread distribution.
So there's this intention behind it, this idea of reaching a wider audience.
Absolutely. And the book actually highlights a trend that's been evolving. He calls it a movement towards a global, totalized, organic, and environmental design.
Okay, now that sounds like a mouthful.
It is, kind of, but it essentially points to a more integrated approach, where designers think about the interconnectedness of things, the impact on the wider world.
Yeah, that definitely aligns with all the conversations happening around sustainability these days.
Mhm.
Now, the source also brings up this idea of campo de acción versus mercado.
Hi!
Sounded like a pretty crucial distinction to me.
It is. The campo de acción, which means field of action, essentially represents the full scope of possibilities within design. It's unconstrained, forward-looking, focused on what could be.
So it's about potential then.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the current limitations and thinking about the full potential of design.
Sounds kind of idealistic.
It is, in a way. And then you've got the mercado, which means market. This represents the existing reality, the current demands, the limitations,
So what's popular right now? What's selling?
Right, and the author really pushes designers to look beyond those immediate market demands and focus on that broader potential.
So not just following trends.
Exactly. The market is rooted in past and present experience, he says, while the field of action is about shaping the future.
Interesting. So how did designers actually think about all this? I mean, how do they approach these challenges? The book talks about algorithmic versus heuristic thinking. What's the difference?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Algorithmic thinking is what we usually associate with logic, step-by-step problem solving. It's linear, convergent, follows a set process.
Like an algorithm, I guess.
Exactly. And it's definitely important in design. But the book emphasizes that it's only one part of the mental activity involved.
So that's the more structured, analytical side of things.
Right. And then there's heuristic thinking, which is all about discovery. It's about dealing with circumstantial truth, things that haven't been fully verified yet.
So it's a bit more exploratory.
Yeah, exactly. And divergent thinking, which is all about generating lots of different ideas, is a product of this heuristic approach.
Makes sense. So it's not just about following a formula. You also need that creativity, that willingness to explore and experiment.
Absolutely. And then he also mentions lateral thinking, which operates on the principle that any way of looking at a situation is just one of many. It encourages us to think outside the box, consider ideas that might seem counterintuitive at first.
Because sometimes the craziest ideas lead to the most innovative solution.
Exactly. So to really tackle a design challenge effectively, you often need a combination of both algorithmic and heuristic thinking. He even gives this example of designing a municipal organizational chart and how the solution came from blending logical analysis with a more intuitive leap.
Oh, interesting. So it's not one or the other. It's both working together.
Right. Now things get even more fascinating when he brings in the psychological side of things. He starts talking about creativity and the unconscious, even bringing in Freud and Lacan.
Oh, wow. So we're going deep into the mind here.
We are. He explores these ideas, connecting creativity to the libido, that fundamental human energy driven by desire. He suggests that this energy can be sublimated and find fulfillment through creative work.
So in a way, creative expression is a way of channeling in that energy.
That's the implication. Then he shifts to Lacan, who famously argued that the unconscious is structured like a language.
Okay, now that's a mind bender.
It is, but it highlights this really interesting connection between linguistics and creativity. Lacan's idea suggests that even our unconscious creative impulses are somehow structured, organized like language.
So there's a deeper pattern, a structure to even the seemingly random things that pop into our heads.
Exactly. And that brings us to semiotics and visual language.
Okay, so semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. How does that fit into visual design?
Well, the book makes a really important point here. It says that visual language, just like spoken or written language, works through codes. These codes are made up of systems of signs, and those signs can even have their own subcodes. And here's the key takeaway. The relationship between the signifier, which is the visual element itself, and the signified, the meaning it represents, is often arbitrary. It's based on convention, on shared understanding.
Like a red traffic light doesn't inherently mean stop. We've just all agreed that it does.
Exactly. The meaning isn't intrinsic to the red light itself. We've created that connection. He then brings in Peirce's semiotics, which adds these three dimensions to how we understand signs: the syntactic, the semantic, and the pragmatic.
Okay, now that sounds like a linguistics class.
It is, kind of, but it really helps us understand how visuals communicate. So the syntactic dimension is all about the relationships between signs, how they're organized and structured. The semantic dimension looks at the relationship between the signs and what they represent, their denotation, which is the literal meaning, and their connotation, which is the associated ideas and feelings.
And what about pragmatic?
That's all about the effect on the receiver. It's not about whether the message is true or false, but about its impact, the sender's intent. He even touches on how publicity can function like propaganda sometimes.
Because it's trying to persuade you, shape your opinion.
Exactly. Now, all of this leads us to one of the most fundamental concepts in visual perception, Gestalt principles. Remember how the author said this was a highly scientific area?
Yeah, he really emphasized that.
Well, these principles basically describe how our minds naturally organize visual information into these meaningful wholes. They explain why we see things the way we do.
It's about how our brains make sense of all the visual input.
Right. And he highlights several key principles. Simplicity, for example, states that if something is too cluttered, too complicated, we have a hard time recognizing or understanding it. Effective design, therefore, aims for clarity, for a clear organization of parts into a whole.
Makes sense. Our brains like things to be easy to digest.
Exactly. Then there's unity, which is the idea that we grasp the whole before we perceive the individual parts. We tend to group similar or equal elements together.
So if things are close together or look alike, we see them as belonging together.
Right. And that brings us to the principle of similarity itself, which is pretty straightforward. Similar things get grouped together.
Simple enough. What else?
He talks about structure, how we tend to see things as forming the simplest, most stable structures. Then there's equilibrium, or balance, which is all about visual weight and direction. Every element in a design has a sort of visual pull, and balance is about creating a sense of stability, avoiding anything that feels too jarring or arbitrary.
It's about harmony.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's figure and ground, which is this classic idea that we distinguish between a figure that stands out and a background.
Like those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on what you focus on.
Exactly. That's playing with figure and ground. There are a few more principles he covers.
Okay, what else?
Superposition, if things overlap. The one that looks complete is perceived as being in front. Ambiguity, which is this interplay between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions.
Making things look 3D on a flat surface.
Right. And then scale, the relative size of things. Superficiality and depth, how we create the illusion of depth.
Yeah, all these visual tricks.
And then movement. We perceive movement not just in things that are actually moving, but also through static visual cues like lines or implied motion.
So even a still image can create a sense of motion.
Right. He also talks about expansive forms, how they convey vitality, and incomplete forms, where our minds fill in the missing pieces.
So our brains are really active participants in all of this.
They are. It's amazing how much processing goes on behind the scenes.
All right, so we've covered the principles of perception. Now let's talk about the actual tools of the trade, the basic elements of visual language.
The book breaks it down into several core elements.
Okay, like what?
Think of it as the visual atom, the smallest unit. Then there's the line, which is essentially a point in motion.
Okay, so we're building from the ground up.
Exactly. Then there's the plane, a flat surface with 2 dimensions. And by moving a plane, we can create the illusion of volume. Volume itself has 3 dimensions, length, width, depth. And the simplest way to represent it visually is with 3 planes.
Okay, so we're moving from 2D to 3D.
Right. Then, of course, there's color, which is a whole world in itself. Hue, value, saturation. He touches on all of that. And then there's texture, the surface quality of a form, which plays a big role in how we perceive it.
So you've got all these elements at your disposal.
Mm-hmm.
But then how do you actually organize them? The book mentions principles of organization.
Right. These principles are like the framework for structuring all those elements.
Okay, like what?
The axis, for example. It's a real or imaginary line that creates order and gives direction. Symmetry and asymmetry, those are really powerful for conveying different feelings.
Yeah, symmetry usually feels more stable, more balanced, while asymmetry is more dynamic, maybe a bit more edgy.
Exactly. He also talks about directionality, which is the dominant direction of lines and how that can guide the eye and create different effects.
Horizontal for movement, vertical for stability, things like that.
Right. And then there's space, positive space, negative space, and how we perceive it. Modularity, which is using repeating units to create structure.
So it's all about bringing order to the chaos.
In a way, yeah.
Cool.
Now, the book then goes into more detail about the program and methodology in design. It mentions things like reticles and pictograms.
Okay, let's break those down.
A reticle is basically a grid, an invisible framework for organizing elements on a page. Think about how magazines or websites are laid out.
It creates structure, makes things easier to follow.
Yeah, exactly. Pictograms are those simple visual symbols that convey a message, often across language barriers. like airport signs, for example.
Yeah, those little pictures that tell you where the bathroom is or where to find baggage claim.
Right. Then there's abstraction, which is about focusing on the general characteristics rather than the specific details.
So it's a way of simplifying, finding the essence of something.
Exactly. And then he talks about series and serial interaction, which is about designing with a sequence of related elements. Typology, which is grouping things based on shared characteristics.
Organizing, categorizing.
Right. Systems, which are sets of interconnected elements working together. And finally, there's the program, which is this really comprehensive plan for coordinating all these different elements and systems.
So we're moving from individual elements to a more strategic approach.
Exactly. And he compares the program in design to an algorithm in computer science, but with these added heuristic elements. It's about thinking about the big picture, the overall strategy.
And that leads us to visual identity programs.
Yeah.
What are those all about?
These are all about creating a consistent visual identity for an organization. It's about the messages they're sending, both intentionally and unintentionally.
So it's branding, essentially.
Exactly. And it involves a lot of research, understanding the organization, defining the desired image, and then it's about applying that consistently across all their different touch points.
Stationery, advertising, even uniforms.
Right. And he emphasizes that modern visual identity programs need to be adaptable, able to work in all sorts of different contexts.
Because the world is constantly changing.
Absolutely. And he gives some really interesting examples from the past: Fiat, Petrobras, Dai, Lucas Industries, showing how they approached visual identity.
So there's a whole history, a whole evolution of this field.
There is. Finally, the book ends with this really thoughtful reflection on the act of design itself.
Okay, what's his takeaway?
He argues that it's more than just technical skill. It involves this leap of faith, this self-confidence, this willingness to create. And he compares it to governing, to love, to justice.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
It is. He's saying that design is about more than just aesthetics. It's about making choices that have an impact on the world, on people's experiences.
So there's an ethical dimension to it.
Exactly. And ultimately, he argues that the act of design can be considered an act of good. It's about creating positive outcomes.
Now that's something to think about.
It is. So for you, the listener, I think there are some key takeaways from this deep dive. First, design is way more complex than you might think. It's rooted in science, in psychology, in all these different fields. Second, understanding how visual language works can really change how you see the world around you. Third, Gestalt principles are incredibly powerful tools for understanding visual perception and creating effective communication.
And they're everywhere once you start looking for them.
Exactly. Fourth, thinking about design in terms of systems and programs can really elevate your approach.
It's about thinking strategically, about the big picture.
And finally, remember that design is more than just aesthetics. It's about making choices, and those choices have consequences. It's about creating a better world.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought. If design is truly an act of good, how can we use these principles, this understanding, to not just communicate more effectively, but to create a more thoughtful, more beautiful, more just world around us? What's our responsibility as creators and consumers of visual information? That's something we can all ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.